Is that okay with you both?
Yeah,
goes first?
I would have suggested that he should go first. Yeah, 7 minutes. Oof. Oh. Okay.
Yeah, well, you don't have to use the whole 7 minutes. Most people don't. It's just available for you to use.
Okay.
From there, we'll move right into the back and forth. You'll have an hour and a half, roughly.
Okay.
And then you'll move into your closing statement, and then we'll have super chats and callers, okay?
Okay.
A lot of people are probably going to want to engage with this debate. So we appreciate you coming on, Bohdi. I know it was a real pain in the ass because of the difference in streaming services we all use, but appreciate it very much.
Yeah, sorry for being late, by the way. I had a business call that decided they're supposed to call me at 2. They ended up calling me 40 minutes ago.
Yeah. Well, no problem, man. Well, you're here now, and we're going to get this thing moving, okay? I'm going to put you in the background. You're going to hear a little bit of music, and then we'll be rolling. All right. It's getting shut down on YouTube, ladies and gentlemen. And why? You want me to go get him? B. Okay, so we're just going to pretend that I wasn't hanging out with you guys for 30 minutes right before the show started, and we'll do the whole spiel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Crucible. I'm your host, Andrew Wilson. You might be wondering why I'm bundled up. I'm on backup power, running off a generator. Ice storm knocked everything out, but the show must go on. We can't let JF Gary Effie go without a show. And also, newcomer to the Crucible, Dad Bohdi. Really appreciate him coming in, spending the time. If you want to send in a super chat, we will get to all audience questions. We will be taking callers tonight. You can hop in the Discord for that. You'll see the Dono chat link. It's pinned at the top of the
So they're taking a little interlude right now or whatever. Let me turn off my camera so they don't see me speaking. Hold up. Where are the people who are supposed to help me host this? Where are they? Let's get the YouTube link. I'm gonna put a link. Oh, there we go. Hello, elephant. I'm gonna put the link to the live broadcast, like as a comment here. My co-host who's supposed to help me. Hold up, brother. My co-host, who was supposed to be helping me, just didn't show up. So there's a link. I'm just gonna put the link up top, you guys. I don't know what happened to the people who were supposed to be helping me run the space. They just didn't show up. No one did. So I'm not gonna be as useful. I will unmute when the debate is happening, but you might just want to go to the link there, honestly. And I'll probably keep this going, but it'll probably be like 4 callers, right? I'll be like, okay, this person has a question, that person has a question. If you guys have questions for JF, all right.
All right, bet.
JF, longtime debater on the Crucible. Appreciate you coming back for this fine debate. Why don't you take a second, introduce yourself, tell everybody briefly about yourself and where they can find you.
I'm Jean-François Gariepi. I'm the author of The Revolutionary Phenotype, an important book about the emergence of life. I'm a neuroscientist. and a biologist. And you can find me at JFG Tonight on Odyssey or at JFGarryP on Twitter.
Highly recommend both channels. Also recommend you buy the book, The Revolutionary Phenotype. I read it. I thought it was very interesting. It's a little bit above the Irish pay grade, right? But you can't blame me for that. Dat Bohdi,
Yeah.
first time to the Crucible. Nice to meet you. Why don't you briefly tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is at Negro Pessimist. You can also find me on Twitch at Dat Bohdi. It's the same name that you see here, and on YouTube. My interests are like philosophy, mathematics. I do talk about politics. I dip into politics a bit. So if you're interested in that and you like what you hear today, give me a follow. Yeah, that'll be all.
All right, thank you so much. We did agree in the background that JF Garriepi would go first. The topic tonight is race and IQ, or we both settled that that is the topic.
All right, yes.
Okay. JF, you have 7 minutes on the clock whenever you're ready.
All right, so let's get started. Thanks for that, Bohdi, and thanks to Andrew for organizing this. I am a race realist in the sense that I believe that races exist. And I believe that races exist based on the definition of the Merriam-Webster. If you look at the biology section of the definition of race, Merriam-Webster will give you a definition that you'll find in many other dictionaries, which is that race is a group within a species that is distinguishable as morphologically, genetically, or behaviorally from others of the same species. That is a quite simple definition, and it is what I mean when I say race. When I say race, I ask myself, is this category that may have been come about by political or social means, by linguistic tricks, by just people's intuition on how much they look like each other and how much they don't look like each other, does this category capture a morphological, genetic, or behavioral difference? And it makes no doubt to me that there are morphological, genetic, and behavioral differences between the races of planet Earth in the human species. Makes no doubt to me that the Asians are visually distinguishable from the Africans, that the Africans are visually distinguishable from the Europeans, and that you can see those differences pass through the generations in a way that suggests that they are genetic, and it makes no doubt to me you don't have to have a scientific paper or a big scientific study to determine that races exist. You simply go to an hospital and you look at whether parents that are Asian will give birth to Asian babies. Parents who are African will give birth to African babies, and parents who are white will give birth to white babies. That is sufficient to meet the definition that says a group within a species that is distinguishable morphologically. Now we can explore the concept of race deeper, and it turns out that the superficial differences that one can see, they only hide further differences that can be detected at the genetic level between the races.
Mom, I'm doing it right now.
And they can be detected also at the behavioral level. So let's get started on is the labeling that we give. Like when people say I am African, or I am African American, or I am white, or I am Asian, how right are they about this? Well, Guro et al. In 2014 published an article named Genetic Bioancestry and Social Construction of Racial Classifications in Social Surveys in the Contemporary United States. It turns out that if you classify people by genes, so you basically classify them using a clustering algorithm, and of course white people end up together in that classification, and of course black people end up together in that classification. But then you compare what the computer comes to in terms of classification, and you say, how right are people in self-reporting their race? It turns out people are extremely accurate in reporting what race they are of. White people at 99.5% will be successfully identifying themselves as white. Black people at 99.3% will be successful at identifying themselves as black. South Asian, 100%. East Asians, 97.7% were accurate in their own self-racial evaluation. What can we conclude from this study by Guro et al.? Quite simple. People's intuition about what racial makeup they have, is correct by genetic standards. And if you were to ask a genomic specialist to look into someone's genes, they probably would be just as good as someone just looking at the face of the person at categorizing their race. That is, when people call themselves white and call others white and call others black, they have captured an enormous amount of genetic information that they have integrated in their intuition and their ability to observe. So the categories of race correspond to a genetic reality. Now we can ask, as far as the differences between behaviors, well, those differences are well known. There are differences across groups, and I ask people to be understanding here that I live in Canada. I don't have freedom of speech, and I cannot fully describe the differences that we're talking about here. And I hope that Bohdi will understand. I guess you're in America right now, so perhaps he can say it, but that doesn't mean I can.
I'll do it for you if you want. Yeah.
But I will always talk of the differences between groups as differences between groups. I will not reveal which side as the difference, as the most difference. So there are definitely differences between groups that have been recorded and detected and that are stable across the decades in terms of criminality, in terms of likelihood of eventually ending up in jail, in terms of IQ, and in terms of success in things that are related to IQ, such as scholar success. So definitely those would fall into the behavioral differences category that are established in science and that don't seem to have moved very much other than through affirmative action and other ways in which we basically undermine the meritocratic system of the US by rewarding people for their skin color. But remove this affirmative action and there is a stable difference between the groups that is observed across the races, where certain races are outperforming others in the domain of criminality, while other races are outperforming others in the domain of IQ. Now we can ask the question, are there links between those different dimensions of race? So on the one hand, we have the morphological and genetic difference, they exist. The behavioral differences, they exist. We can ask ourselves about the chains of causality that lead a group or an individual to be more intelligent, to have more propensity for psychiatric disorders of certain kinds. I'm hearing
quick 30 seconds to finish it off, JF, but your time has run out. Go ahead.
So as far as determining the link between any behavior that we might be interested in and genes, a study like this just compounds all knowledge that we have acquired from twin studies, from genome-wide association studies. And what those studies reveal in general is that pretty much any cognitive human behavior is caused by genes. As far as IQ goes, it's in the range of 80% of the variance explained by genes according to twin studies. So to me, this leaves no doubt that differences that are linked to groups that were identified, and particularly groups that differ genetically, will at least have an important part explained by genetics. So that does it for my intro.
All right. Thank you so much, JF. JF did go slightly over Bohdi. It's okay if you want to take an additional 30 seconds for your opening statement as well. You can. But you have 7 minutes on the clock. You can use it all. You can use as little as you want, whatever you want before we get into the debate. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing that is telling is that we have a PhD biologist who, instead of using a biological definition of what race is, or what he believes that race is, because this is an issue of taxonomy, right? Are there subdivisions of the human race? Are human beings polytypic, meaning that you need there are many types of humans, right? There's this Pokemon, there's the electric type, there's the fire type, that kind of sort of basic concept. Instead of appealing to biology, he appeals to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And I think that says enough in of itself. And I'm going to reject his definition on the grounds that you actually need to provide a metric for what you mean when you talk about the differences between people, right? So if we look at people's short tandem repeats, right? So people's, look at their genes, ATCG, right? There sometimes randomly people might have a G, right? Or another person has a T or something like that, right? Yeah, 23andMe can map and say this person is Chinese and this person is Japanese based off of these short tandem repeats with a degree of probability. That does not, however, is not a measure of how different those populations are. It's literally just looking at the differences and using those differences to distinguish between populations. And so, insofar as there's been no metric established as to what a race is from a biological perspective, and like how you would measure that difference from a biological perspective, there's nothing here to debunk for me. When it comes to this idea, like, oh, the study, people are very good at identifying their race. Yeah, you're right. And what JF is really appealing to is the fact that race, as constructed, is based off of phenotype. And insofar as it's based off of phenotype, I could go to the Andaman Islands and I could find people who look like sub-Saharan Africans. They truly do. I'm not talking about Australian Aboriginals. I'm not talking about all Polynesians, not Negritos. People specifically from like the Sentinel Islands can look like black people, right? Quote unquote sub-Saharan Africans. But their genetics is actually quite divergent from those populations. And so anyone arguing about race from a phenotypical perspective is really arguing about a social construct that is grounded in phenotype, which in phenotype is grounded in genes. What they fail to do when making this argument is to understand that the genes that determine like skin color, right? What percentage of human genes determine skin color, right? How, like, if we talk about more skull morphology, how much of that distinguishment, right? How much of that difference, that variation is within populations versus between different human populations? They'll never address that. And we're going to go into that today because I haven't been given a definition of race, but I'm going to work with JF here. You know, I see what he's saying. He's appealing to criminality. He's appealing to prison, IQ, scholastic success. And he's also appealing to the fact that affirmative action undermines meritocracy in the United States. Now, there's one hypothesis is that these people, and he's referring to black people very clearly, are just genetically inferior in the United States. And there's the alternative hypothesis where instead of looking at things one-dimensionally, we use our mental tools and we ask the question, could there be another explanatory factor? Maybe he's right. Maybe these people are, but to what extent? Can JF give us the answers to what extent is it genetic and to what extent is it environmental, right? And if it's genetic, then this has to be a trend that goes way back into far history. And if we look into the far history of humanity, we should see that Europeans are and have always been superior to black people. That's not what we see. How much time do I have left?
You still have 3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. Oh, God. So that's what we're going to do today. The framework is this. We need JF to actually give us a biological definition of what race means, right? The second thing is once he gives us a definition of what that means, that definition has to comport with the idea of subspecies across the board. He needs to look at subspecies of chimpanzees and tell us what's the genetic distance between these that establish that they are polytypic. Then he needs to do that for human populations. And then he's going to need to explain why is it that we find most human genetic variation in one quote unquote race that is called, not race, but one continent called Africa. And that includes sub-Saharan Africa, right? It's not just the difference between sub-Saharan Africans and North Africans. Africa is the most genetically diverse place on the planet. Even when it comes to Khoisan people, their ancestors are one of the first groups to splinter off from the rest of humanity. They have more diversity than the rest of humanity. One could argue that there are two races, right? The Khoisan and everybody else. Maybe you can throw the pygmies in, the Twa in with the Khoisan, right? But he's not going to be able to deal with that. And he's not going to be able to deal with the fact that all of these sociological studies, because he's appealing to sociology at this point, show that actually racism, people's environments, their income do impact their life outcomes, right? And that you can appeal to criminality and stereotypes all you want, but at the end of the day, what's the metric? You got to prove it. He has a burden of proof that he will not be able to meet.
Is that the last of your opening statement, Bohdi?
Yeah, I would also add is like, again, we would have to see this trend stretch out far into history, because the traits which differentiated these different races did not emerge 100, 400 years ago. They should have been here maybe hundreds of thousands, right? At least of years.
Okay. Thank you so much for that opening statement from both participants. I will get both of their links down underneath the Odyssey and Comfy streams that are going on currently. Again, you can find both of them. I will put this on Twitter as well so that you can reach them. Congratulations to JF. They finally gave him his back. So that was kind of neat to see him back on Twitter. Gentlemen, before we start, I just wanted to very quickly remind everybody that we will be taking callers tonight after we open the floor up, after the debate is done. I'm sure plenty of people are going to have questions for both participants. You can also send in a super chat via Dono Chat, or you can use the integrated system in Odyssey if you prefer that. And we will get all of those super chats asked to the participants. Gentlemen, the floor is open. Go ahead.
All right, so perhaps we can start on the question of the definition. I want to be clear. I took a definition from Merriam-Webster, but it is not something that would shock any biologist. In fact, here's a quote from Jerry Coyne, the author of Speciation, arguably the expert on the question of species, subspecies, clades, a man who's interested specifically in the process that leads to one species becoming two species. So certainly an expert who qualifies here as a biologist who's an authority on the subject. And he says in his blog post, "Are there human races?" He says, "What are races? In my own field of evolutionary biology, races of animals, also called subspecies or ecotypes, are morphologically distinguishable populations that live in allopatry, i.e. are geographically separated." And he would, of course, add, or sexually separated in other cases. There is no firm criterion on how much morphological difference it takes to delimit a race. Races of mice, for example, are described solely on the basis of difference in coat color, which could involve only one or two genes. So a difference that's as small as one noticeable physical difference and one or two genes involved in those differences is sufficient to define a race, according to Jerry Coyne, which is totally in line with the Merriam-Webster definition here.
So you're saying, how many differences do we need? I'm confused. How many differences do we need to define a race?
One would suffice.
So,
to
okay,
meet the standard
right.
of this definition.
So then the number of races becomes, how many people on the planet today? 7 billion, right? Darwin talks about this, right? Every single specimen, unless it's a twin, or a clone rather, is unique. Everyone has, I mean, you don't have the same DNA as your parents, JF. Are you a different race from your parents because you have some different genes? And then you have to look at populations. How much variation is within populations? How much variation is between populations? If you wanted to establish race as a biological and genetically sound thing, what you would need to do is show that when you look at black people, right, very little difference between black people. But when you compare black people to white people, it's huge. In fact, the gap that you see between black people and white people should be larger than the gap that you see within quote unquote black people. And that's a fact that we established in our last conversation. I just want to real quick cite, I believe this is from Tishkoff 2009.
Well, hang on, Bohdi. Before you get into a citation, let him respond to your first point, and then we can move on to the second point.
Oh, I was just trying to give the evidence. Yeah, I was just trying to give the evidence of my claim. Sorry.
Okay, if you want to reinforce it with evidence, you can.
Yeah, so for example, Tishkoff in 2009, this is just one example. She used it's called an F statistic, right? FST. right? And the S stands for a subpopulation, T stands for the total population. It measures how much variation is within a subpopulation versus how much a variation is within a population, right? It's pretty standard to note that an FST value of 0.3 or above is moderate. An FST value of 0.5 shows strong population subdivision, right? And an FST of 1 is like, oh, these are complete. This is from a different planet, right? When it comes to human beings, right, the FST is 0.15. It does not reach the level of statistical significance. And I'll leave it there.
It's not what we call statistical significance. What you are applying here are subjective human words like moderate. That has no value in science at all. By the way, there are species of wolves that are divided in subspecies that are much lower than the FST distance that you get between human races. So by this standard, if these subspecies of wolves must exist, certainly human races would help us, would qualify to be called races and perhaps even to be called subspecies, which is an equivalent term. As far as the fallacy of the intra differences would have to be smaller than the intergroup differences to qualify, I want to debunk this with a very simple example. If you open your Paint program on Microsoft Windows and you choose the squash of colors, they will let you choose in a 2D space of colors. And you'll see that, of course, there's a part of this selection of color that will be more bluish, and another part will be more yellowish, another part will be more reddish. And you will note that within the red category, there's almost an infinite number of points you could select. You can select red of different tints, you can select red of different intensities and different degrees of purity. In other words, within the category red of your selection of color, you have an almost infinite number of declinations of types of red. Yet, red is still different from blue. This difference may be summed up as a single difference. Red is a color, blue is a different color, but there are so many various ways of being blue and so many various ways of being red that if what Bohdi has said about intra versus inter-category differentiation was true, then you would have to acknowledge that there is no such thing as a difference between red and blue. The fact is that the diversity within a category does not negate the diversity between categories. That is obviously true, and it's a fallacy to think otherwise.
Yeah, so what you just described is a continuum. So let me make this analogy quick, right? So between 0 and 1, there's an uncountable infinity of numbers, right? Cool. That doesn't mean anything about how distant any point between 0 and 1 is between the point at 17. Those are not connected ideas. So what you're saying is, well, look, there's a lot of things in this category. Okay, we're talking about distances. You're talking about, taxonomy. We're talking about a metric. We're talking about FST. Your whole color analogy, thanks for that, man. I appreciate it. It has nothing to do with the actual science. The science says this is that you look within a human, you look any human being on earth, 70% of their DNA is the same. 70% of their DNA, the same. Okay? When you look at human genetic variation, right? 85% of that with any given population, right, is going to be within human populations, right? And then when you look between populations, you get 15%. That's where that 0.15 comes from in Tishra. Now, other people have calculated it and got different results, right? But what JF is appealing to is a lack of understanding. Okay, when you appeal to color, what you're appealing to is this: is like, oh, I can see the differences between these two things. You can have moths which are different colors, very different colors, right? It could be that it's just a few genes that determine this, or it could be that there exists in a cline. That is called that's the difference between polytypic, right? Um, and something that is more of a cline, like, right? So when you think of human beings, skin color, yes, skin color is highly variable between populations. Yeah, skin color would be a good argument, right? The issue with using skin color is that you have populations like Indians who have the same skin color as other people, and most of your DNA is not going to be determined by what color skin that you have. In fact, you can select for a trait such as height, and you could divide humanity up by height, and you would get a different set of races, right? Or you can divide them up by, I don't know, some gene for teeth, and then you get a different race. My question is this: what is the ultimate metric that you're going to use to establish this race? You can't come up with one.
Distinguishability is my metric, and as far as having different alternative definitions of race, I don't mind. Something doesn't become untrue because other things are true. You could tell me, hey, Jeff, I can divide the population by hair color if I only focus on this one gene. Sure, go ahead. And you'd be capturing something of reality here. But we all know what we're talking about when we talk about race. We're not talking about a single gene. We're not talking about two genes. We're talking about the clustering of genetics in humanity, which is readily observable if you pool enough genetic data from all humanity. Now you triggered me to respond in scientific terms of FST distance. Sure, let's do it. This is from the alternativehypothesis.org, a list of different FST distances within various species and the recognized number of subspecies in those species. So as you mentioned, humans are at 0.121 FST distance, which places us in a moderate amount of variation. But we never engage on the question of how many subspecies are present in the human species. However, in all of these other cases, look at this. North American coyotes, there are 19 recognized subspecies in biology, and they have less variation in FST distance than humans. North American wolverines, between 2 and 3 subspecies recognized, less variation than in humans. Jaguars, 9 subspecies recognized, 0.06 FST distance, that's close to 2 times, but that's about 2 times less than humans. African buffalo, 5 recognized subspecies, 0.059 lower FST distance than humans. All of these animals, Canadian lynx, whales, zebras, wildcats, antelopes, European cow, red-winged blackbird, all have lower FST distance than in the human population, and yet they have any number from 5 to 18 subspecies recognized for all of those categories. So what do you have to say about that? You seem to be objecting to the concept of race in the human species. Yeah. Do you object to the Canadian lynx being categorized as such?
So do you know what an FST is?
FST distance is a measure of genetic variability, pairwise genetic variability between different members of a group.
Right. So if you look at humans FSTs, it actually depends on like what trait you're looking at, right? So if I could share my screen, yeah. Oh, here we go. So this is Professor Nyong'o. He just cites, American Journal of Physical Anthropology, and yeah, okay. When you look at and among regions is essentially races here. Among local populations within regions is like ethnicity. So French people versus Germans, right? And then within local populations is like within Germans. Okay, so I mean, if I'm looking for blood polymorphisms, microsatellite DNA, RFLPs, craniometrics, right? Generally, the trend is that it's polytropic and not polytypic, which means there's more variation over here within these populations than there is between these different races. Okay, and JF is trying to distract from this fact because it's inconvenient. But when you look at skin color, and if he wants to discuss skin color, we can. That's actually polytypic. That's polytypic. And so if you want to make your argument about skin color, we can go ahead and talk about skin color. But beyond that, as you get more and more information, right? Nyong'o shows that variation between these populations actually drops as you put in more and more sort of traits and genetic data. It drops. I think that he got it down to like five. Not him, but the paper got it down to like 5%, right? Between these different quote unquote races. Um, and if you compare human beings, for example, Tishkoff found to like chimpanzees, right? The eastern chimpanzee versus the western chimpanzee, they have what is it, twice the FST that human beings have, right? So maybe I would say, hey, they don't meet the mark of chimpanzees, and therefore they're not um, they're not different races, right? I, and the definition of a sub race, right? His definition is that there's any difference, which means I could technically argue that these populations that I shared here, right, Germans, for example, they're actually a whole bunch of different races. By that metric, they're a whole bunch of different races. So what are we really talking about here at that point?
Well, we're talking about, does the fact that there are multiple different reds cancel the ID of red? Is the fact that declinations of higher resolution of a certain phenomena suddenly cancel the macroscopic observation? And it doesn't. It's a fallacy to think that because more detail could be possibly available, that the larger observation does not stand anymore. There is no domain of science in which this is even argued, except when it comes to race denialism. Now, I don't know what it is that you brought with chimpanzees and FST distance, because I totally answered your question. If you were to set a threshold of FST distance where you accept to suddenly declare that a race exists, you would have to either accept that races exist in the human species, or that we are wrong to recognize subspecies of gray wolves and North American coyotes and Canadian lynx. So which one is it? If you were telling me earlier in the debate that FST distance is the criteria that you recognize as scientific, what is it?
I mean,
are we wrong in dividing the wolverine population?
I'm confused. I don't know if you saw the chart, right? But I'm just gonna. Should I share this too? I don't know if hammering the point home is the right approach here. Just a second. I'm just looking for the number. That would be it. Okay. So yeah, I mean, let me just give you the number as they increase. Share screen. Yeah. So yeah, geographical race accounts for less than 5% of genetic differences based off of 377 genes in 52 populations. So it goes down as they add more of these sort of traits. And again, within populations, you see a greater gap. And so JF, it's a statistic. It's a measure of distance. Okay? So just because
But is
hold
there
up.
anything on this graph that is FST? Because I don't see any measure of FST here. So I want to understand: are you providing a counterpoint to my FST claim,
It
or are
literally
you
is.
making a separate
It's
claim?
literally a variance components. What are you talking about? It's looking at
Variance
the
is not
it's
FST.
looking at the variance between these different populations. And also, I cited Tishkoff. I don't know if you're familiar with Tishkoff 2009. She gives an FST for humans, right? But again, if the FST is 0.15, right, between different groups, that means within a group you have an FST of 0.85. So again, my argument stands. You're not going to escape this, JF, in that we have a ruler, right? We have a standard unit of length, JF, to measure how different people are. Okay? You are trying to say the ruler only matters when I cite Philip J. Rushton, and I can say there's a difference between black people and white people. Okay, fine. Yes, there is a difference. You're right. But now let's look at the differences within white people, and let's look at the differences within black people. And then now, that metric is actually bigger than the one that you're trying to use to divide humanity. And so there is more of an argument now for us to say that black people, right, or white people, or any given population, there's a whole bunch of different races, right? And by the way, your inability to even name the different races tells us that you don't, not only do you not have a metric, right, you haven't done any of the work right? As someone who can do the work, you're a PhD, right? You've done none of the work to truly establish this. Even though you are a PhD biologist, you've simply not been able to do it.
Well, I will conclude that this graph is irresponsive to my claim of FST. Now you come back with the Lewontin fallacy, which I've already addressed. I've said what I had to say about this. The fact that more differences exist in other dimensions than race, sure. And divide Africa in whatever amount of races you want. I really, literally don't give a shit. Now, as far as defining what the races are to me, well, they are readily observable on these graphs of K cluster algorithm. You ask a computer to classify by likeliness the set of genes that you have from 2,000 individuals, and of course, people who are very genetically similar end up together on those graphs, and we can see that they correspond to white, black, Asian, native, and those definitions seem to hold here on the genetic look. When you look at the genome, they seem to correlate with our intuitive concepts of white, American Indian, Middle Eastern, North African, Oceanian, African, non-Indian, Asian, European, and Central Asian. This is a categorization that fits the data, that explains the data well, and that allows us to talk about most pose of differentiation. Even if there may be intermixing between these different groups, they still remain distinguishable, and therefore they, referring back to my Merriam-Webster or Jerry Cohen definition of race, they fit that definition of distinguishability.
So let me tell you why you're struggling here. Um, French people are different than German people, right?
Yes.
They're different. Establishing that they're different doesn't. I mean, I
Yes.
could also say French people are different than raccoons, right?
Yes.
Oh, maybe. I hypothesize it's true. And so if that's true, French people are different than they're different from raccoons. They're different from Germans. What is the next thing that a 10-year-old will be able to tell you that you should do to solve the mystery? Well, now you have to look at how different they are. And that's what you're not able to do. You're just like, oh, there's a K cluster. We can associate people with ancestry. You can't give the statistic. The statistics don't agree with you. When it comes to, you look at a human super tree. I showed you last time we spoke. Europeans and Eurasians are actually nestled within Africans. They are. They're just another African population. They're not divergent at all. They're not special. The special populations are populations like the Khoisan. They get to be their own race, maybe, right? They have a lot of genetic distance from the rest of humanity, it seems, and a lot more genetic diversity, by the way. The same is true for other hunter gatherers, such as the Twa people in Africa. Why is it that people have constructed race in this way? Well, because it's easy to do. I mean, skin color is super obvious. It's not scientific, however. There is a this man, Philip Kitcher, right? PhD. He goes into the Stanford study, and in the Stanford study, they looked at DNA sequences of different human beings, and they tried to do what JF was talking about, right? When n equals 2, you have Africans, most Asians, Europeans, and then everyone else. So Africans and Europeans, same race, and so are most Asians if n equals 2. If n equals 3, then you have that first group without Africans, then you have Africans, and then you have everyone else, right? N equals 5, that's the one that I think JF might like, even though it doesn't fit his description right now, is that, oh, there's 5 of them. Then you could get 6 of them. And then you could get 7 of them. Again, you're giving me things. You're telling me apples are different than bananas. Thank you so much, JF. That's so great. I think we've established that. Now tell us, how different are they? And you won't be able to answer that question because it is inconvenient to your narrative.
Well, the answer as to how races are different, it hovers between 0.10 to 0.13 of FST distance, depending on which pairwise comparisons you do within humanity between whites, blacks, and Asians. Now, as far as the K being increased and therefore the races being increased, Europeans can be seen as part of the African race at the K equals 2, in the same way that Pac-Man is undistinguishable from the wall that hosts the Pac-Man in a bad 8-bit old computer game that is too low resolution to distinguish between the two. Now increase the resolution and ta-da, you see the difference. This is not hard to understand. Of course, when you look at things with a rough loop of low resolution, you end up not distinguishing things that are meant and easy to distinguish when you look at a higher resolution.
Right, sure. Okay, so but here's the thing. You want you want to establish Africans and black people as a race, right? So hold up, if you want to say Africans are a race, I'm going to need that category of Africans, right, to be more similar to one another than they are to Europeans. And the reason why you still have failed, everyone know, JF, not giving a statistic to say, well, because these people are this distant, they are now a race. He will never do that. He cannot do that. He's a smart man. He's knowledgeable. He cannot do it, which is why this has been settled in biology. This has been settled. This is not even eugenics, because eugenics at least was able to disguise itself as something that was scientific. We know this is not scientific. And JF knows it's not scientific. He would rather look at the sociological implications of race and skin color and what that looks at today than to actually really break down for us, as someone who is more knowledgeable in biology than probably most people on the planet, right? He'd rather do that than really tell us what are the subspecies. Is there like are Europeans Neanderthal? Are black people, are they like rock type Pokemon? And then you have Asians who are like water type Pokemon. He won't do any of that because he can't. And that is what we're showing today.
I'm happy to do it. I will take a stand that I've never been forced to take because I don't really care about the precision of it. But okay, you're forcing me down the line. I'm looking at human differentiation, FST distance between, and I know that this is one single number, but the reality is if you look at African versus European, you have something around 0.11, and then you include Asians in the bunch and it becomes 0.13. But okay, I'll take a position. Any significantly detectable and statistically significant FST distance between any group above 0.01 FST justifies a categorization of subspecies if combined with an observable difference that is physical and morphological. And so that would totally place the human species as distinguishable between races. And as far as the point that Bohdi did about the Africans, you must show that the Africans are more similar than they are from the European. That is simply not true, because a distinction can exist between two categories, even if more detailed distinctions exist within those categories.
You say more detailed instead of saying the actual thing that you should say. The word is larger. Again, you're running away from basic metrics because, again, it's hard to really establish these other races. You say, oh, it's 0.01 or something like that. Okay, sir, that would mean that you are a different race than your third cousin. Is this a useful definition? Now, you could work with that definition. It's fine. I'm just wondering what that explains, how that helps us. I just want to really quickly also. Oh, my screen is sharing already. Okay, great. I also wanted to share.
Do you want me to pull that up for you, buddy?
Can I just send it to you? Yeah, I like sending things rather than clicking the screens. I hate
well,
that thing.
I can't pull it up that way, but I can pull up your stream if you want to add. If you want to share the screen like you were just doing.
Oh yeah.
The only reason I had it pulled down was because it
yeah, thanks for that, by the way. I didn't even know it was on. So, look, there's larger genetic differences within Africans than between Africans and Eurasians. The worldwide pattern of SNP's variation is of great interest to human geneticists.
I'm sorry, did you want me to pull that up?
Is it? Is it not up already? Yeah, I want it up.
No, I can pull it up. Okay.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, so the worldwide pattern of SNP variation is of great interest to human geneticists, population geneticists, and evolutionists, but remains incompletely understood. We studied the pattern in non-coding regions because they are less affected by natural selection than our coding regions. Thus, it can reflect better the history of human evolution and can serve as a baseline for understanding the maintenance of SNPs in human populations. And they found that the African diversity estimate is even higher than that between Africans and Eurasians. And so, here's the reason why. And JF will also not appeal to this. This is another metric that JF won't appeal to. When it comes to speciation, generally, the longer a population is isolated from another population, the more divergent that they will become, generally. And so he needs to actually give numbers of when these different splinter groups happen. He won't give you numbers when these different splinter groups happen. And I'll tell you why. Because if you give me a number of when Eurasians split from them, okay, or when out of Africans split with them, right? Well, let's look at when the Khoisan split from Pygmies. Let's look at when those populations split with who would become East Africans. Let's look at when those populations split from West Africans. And what you'll find is that because humanity has spent most because humanity started in Africa, and we spent so much time in Africa as a species, right? The genetic diversity is extremely high, but also the amount of time that different African populations have spent apart has resulted in large genetic distances, which are larger than the genetic distances in Europeans. And that maps directly to the fact that the time that these populations have been separated is longer than what white people have been separated from East Asians, from when Eurasians were separated from other out of Africans, from when out of Africans have been separated from Africans. And to add this, right, he keeps on talking about within versus without. Stop. You are a biologist, right? So you have a premise that you have to prove. Your hypothesis is that there are races that they exist. You go into this blind. You look at different populations on Earth. You no longer have an African category. You just have human populations. And you're going to group human populations based off of the metric that you said, that FST, okay? Doing that, you know very well that you would not get a Caucasian race. You know very well that you wouldn't get one African race. And so, what is it? Tell us how many African races there are, and then tell us why is it that these other people get their own races even though they don't have the genetic diversity and distance from Africans to really justify it? Because Khoisan versus Khoisan versus a West African, that's a big gap. But I'm wondering, is that gap how does that gap compare between the distance between Africans in general and Europeans? Would one be larger than the other? What does that mean? How does your theory comport with that? You know?
Well, I've taken position on this before, and I've said I wouldn't mind if we agree that there is 600 races of humans. I really don't care, because even if you agree that there are 600 colors on your swatch color selector, that doesn't mean that there aren't major differences between red, blue, and yellow. And then, yes, you can get into the detail and divide into however arbitrary numbers of group you would like. My criteria has been met. It is distinguishability. Now, you seem to want to defend the idea of 600 African races. Go for it. That's totally fine. Study the genetic diversity of Africa and define an entire world of different races, and that won't abolish the fact that there's a difference between Europeans and Africans. Now, some of the things you say is true. There is more similarity between Europeans and Asians than Europeans and Africans, because yes, probably we have been separating a little later in our evolutionary history. As far as knowing when the races separated, the thing is, you can tell that there are races without knowing exactly when they separated. But the idea is we must have the races as we know them today were probably established by any time between 80,000 years ago and 200,000 years ago. And during this time, there were mixes that happened between, for example, Europeans, Asians, and Neanderthal that don't seem to have happened for Africans. And so that's the reason we have Neanderthal genes in the white population, in the Asian population, but not in the African population. Those are interesting details, but they they're not super relevant at determining if race exists now. Because no matter, we could know the state of the genetic diversity right now without knowing its full evolutionary history. But the fact that we already know some about it indicates, yes, a differentiation, for example, in the Neanderthal part of the genome. You do acknowledge that that Africans do not have the Neanderthal part of the genome that is present in European populations, right?
I think that you're speaking to a trend that they have less than. There was a study that found they had like 0.8% or something like that very recently. But you're generally, yeah, they generally have less Neanderthal DNA than out of Africans. That's true. That's true.
All right.
And you know what?
That
I don't want to take away your identity, JF. I identify as a human being, a part of Homo sapiens sapien, fully 100%. But if you are a biracial man, I support you.
If I'm a biracial man, but well,
because that's a race.
Uniracial man.
Wouldn't you say Neanderthals are a different race?
Oh no, Neanderthals, they classify to me as an ancestral population, but not a current.
To you,
race.
Because you're biracial. Yeah, I'm not.
Well,
I'm fully human.
The thing is, the concept of race doesn't make sense if you try to extrapolate it in the timeline with the past.
But you wait. So wait a second.
Race makes a sense.
So modern day.
Hang on, Bohdi, hang on. You can ask your question, but if you guys have too much overlap, there's actually a linguistic difference that's slight. And so what ends up happening is we can't understand what's going on with the tone of the conversation. So I'm going to start with you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jay. Go ahead. Finish.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish to say, I want to clarify, I am not biracial. I have passed a 23andMe test that confirms that I am 100% of European, French, German, and Scandinavian descent, all Northern, Western European genes. There is not a trace of either Jewish or African or Asian genes in me.
Thank you. You know what they say? Never interrupt your opponent when they're making a mistake, right? So, again, I want everyone to know. I asked him multiple times, "What's the metric? How does it?" He can't. He has not been able to answer that, and he won't because this is an emotional appeal to something. He's appealing to the ideas of Philip J. Rushton and hoping that somehow the fact that he's a PhD will float him by with his audience. It won't, because guess what? Neanderthals are at least 400,000 years divergent from humans. Okay? 400,000 years. We didn't leave Africa 400,000 years ago. No one will say that. And so you're saying that you're the same race as a Neanderthal, someone, a species that likely could have gone extinct because of cannibalism. We don't know. They also competed with cave bears, cave hyenas, cave lions, and guess what? Cave bears outlasted them, right? These are I wouldn't even call them people, frankly, right? These are a species that we're not even sure they could speak, right? But their level of cognition and their physical fitness was so detrimental to the human beings who mixed with them that it's estimated that 94% of the physical fitness was lost. And over time, human beings had to outbreed the genes of Neanderthals, right? But you want to claim that, that's fine. You're a biracial man. You're a part of the human race and the Neanderthal race. Congratulations to you. But if you're going to define Africans as a different race, even though they've only been separated from you from like 100,000, 150,000 years, then Neanderthals are also a separate race. What he just showed us, everybody, is that he doesn't have a metric. He doesn't have a concept that is biologically or scientifically grounded about race. I mean, this man just said, I am not Jewish. I am pure European. Ashkenazi Jews, I'm sorry to break it to you, JF. If you look at their autosomal DNA, it is European. They are close to Italians, which is not surprising because, that's the route that, Jews took into Europe, okay? I have never seen someone say, "Oh, you're Ashkenazi Jews. They're a race of their own. They're literally just a race of their own." Look at they are not a very diverse population, but even by your own metric of lookerism, saying, "Look at that person." Rachel from Friends, I believe. No, Monica from Friends and Ross from Friends. This is a cross-cultural analogy. I got you guys. Monica and Ross from Friends. They're Jewish in the show, One of the actors is not Jewish. I have no fucking idea which one is which, and neither do you. So let's not play games about race in this. You don't have a biological concept of race. Your concept of race is obviously socially constructed. Let's accept that, and then we can move on and talk about how you think black people are inferior and they go to jail and they're criminals and they have low IQs. I think you excel at that more than you excel at this conversation, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, we can move on to the next subject. I will just say that you may be underestimating my ability to recognize the Jewish phenotype. So getting into a second point that you mentioned, you said race is constructed. That's what JF is appealing to. It's based on phenotypic perspective. Phenotypic is a social construct. I mean, this is my notes about what you said, and I wouldn't want to misrepresent you here. But it seems that you believe that because something is observable in the phenotype, that it is not an observation that could found a definition of race. And I disagree. By the definition that we use, in fact, before we even knew about genetics, we were defining subspecies in animals constantly based on morphological characteristics. And in fact, much of our phylogeny in the way we design the branches of life in our study of reptiles and mammals were entirely based on morphology before they were based on any form of genetic work. So it's important to understand that it is scientific to observe how people look and how animals look and how plants look. It gives us extreme amounts of information, ultimately that boils down to genetic information. And so what was your statement exactly about the phenotype? Do you acknowledge that there is a legitimate biological classification that can be entirely based on phenotypic observations?
Oh, okay. So if we just look at the phenotypes of human beings, could we group them into races? I think we already do, right? In the study that you said that we did it very effectively. I mean, and the thing is, skin color is polytypic. It is, right? So skin color genes within a population, they're going to be very similar. Between different populations and races, they're going to be very dissimilar. So that's actually the metric that you can go by. But again, if you use that metric, there are some Indians and some people on some islands near India who would be black, and Australian Aborigines will be black, but their actual DNA is very much different. So okay, let's not just use skin color. Let's also use facial features. And the problem with facial features, right? Like prognatisms. Let's talk about I guess maybe someone has a brow ridge, right? Things like that. What you're trying to appeal to is something called physical anthropology, and it's actually a science, right? It's very different than the race science that you're trying to do. Um, so, for example, populations that have lived together, they form clines. And so, people in Italy and people in places near Italy, as long as there's no genetic barrier between them, they've been sharing genes for a long time. And so, you'll find that they, have adapted to a similar climate, right? A lot of sub-Saharan Africans are tropically adapted. And so, are you saying that I can look at someone and tell what they are? To an extent. Now, I look at you and I think that's a human man. But you've told me that you're biracial and Neanderthal. So apparently it's not very good at being accurate when it comes to the genetics.
Well, you would certainly have known that I'm European, right?
Yeah, no, definitely, yes.
So it seems that you have the very intuition of the concept that I'm appealing to. But that you are engaged in a denial at the technical level.
No, you can tell race by looking at people, yes, because it's socially constructed.
Okay.
Yes.
Because it's socially constructed,
but
then I show that there are correlations between the social construct and genes at the 99+% level.
Well,
people are pointing to genes when they talk about these social constructs.
So there are genes. Again, I said there are genes for skin color. We've already established that. Cool. But you can't use skin color because of the reasons I said prior, right? Comparing like Indians to black people, right?
But people
Andrew
are extremely capable of distinguishing between the black of
you can do that. You can't
and the black of Indians.
Well, I could show you some people that you would struggle with, right? And that's the problem, right? Is that we're now using a subjective measure to try to talk about something that's supposed to be objective, which is why I say it's socially constructed. Andrew, did you say that you were Irish?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, Irish people have been
Irish and English.
Irish people have been racialized as sometimes they're racialized as negroid or something like that, subhuman primates. I've seen it. I've seen the textbooks where they have the Irishmen and the prognatisms and the. I can pull it up if you'd like to see it, Andrew. But I mean that's the same, right?
I've actually dove into some of that. Yeah,
but Irish people, I would say, Andrew.
I know exactly. I know what you're referencing, especially when they came into to the United States. There was definitely a correlation between a social correlation between them and blacks. That for sure happened. That's a historic note that I can point.
It started with Europeans, yeah, and they brought it over to the United States. But I would say Andrew and JF, I would not be. I can't think of JF as anything other than French, because I know who he is. But I probably wouldn't. You guys could be brothers, sure, fine. But to some other human beings at a certain time,
I have a way better beard. It's a way better beard. I'm just saying. But anyway, back to the debate. Sorry.
Yeah, to certain people at certain places and times, you guys would not be the same race. And I don't know how Andrew feels about people who are of European Jewish descent, but in American society, at least from a legal standpoint, ever since 1791, the 1791 Naturalization Act, European Jewish people have been considered to be white. Socially different, legally white, because you couldn't be a citizen of the United States unless you were white. And Irish people, legally white. Legally white. Socially, something else. And that changed in American society over time. So that's why I say it's socially constructed.
That is not super important to me. There may have been errors in the past as to our conceptions of the structure of our categorizations of humans, but none of this changes what we can now know from the genes, that the Irish belong somewhere in the nucleus of Europeans, among the English, not so far from the French and the Germans. So let's talk about, you asked earlier, to what extent is it genetic and to what extent is it environmental? And we were talking, of course, about various behavioral measures. To me, the ultimate answer to this question comes from twin studies as well as genome-wide association studies. And here I have a figure that basically compiles a lot of those studies on various behaviors from educational attainment, income, adult IQ, to the presence of anorexia, bipolar disorder, whether someone drinks, whether someone smokes, how many number of children did someone have. And certainly we can look at the irritability that is estimated from twin family studies. And in blue, we can see that most human behaviors end up having a large part that is caused by genetics, or that is where the explained variance of genetics is high. That is, for example, in IQ, we are at 80%. So adult IQ, the variance that you can observe in a population is explained by 80% by the variance in genes, as assessed by twin studies. So it would be literally impossible if some of the differences between groups in humanity, in terms of IQ, in terms of any of these behaviors listed there, wouldn't be partly caused by genetics in the light of this.
Stop.
Is this something you agree, that genes cause behaviors?
I think genes can influence. I think genes can influence a lot of things. It's weird to like sort of respond to this, but I mean, you're presenting a fallacy in that you're saying that if this can be attributed to genetics, then necessarily.
I'm having trouble hearing.
Hold up.
Can you say that again?
Maybe it is genetics, but anyways, you're assuming, right, that
I couldn't find
that they're
on Amazon
complements,
Music.
that they're complements of one another, right? So that, like, for example, what is when you're saying something is genetically attributable, right? You're saying, what is the probability of you inheriting this from your parent on a genetic basis, right? That doesn't necessarily, that's not the complement of this of the probability that the environment influences you. I think we can all agree that people's environments influence them. It's very like the conditions of the womb are actually extremely predictive of a number of factors, right? Someone's third grade reading level is very predictive about whether they'll be in prison or not, right? And so both are true at the same time. So because something is 80%, you can say it's 80% heritable, right? That doesn't speak at all to how the environment can impact it. And that's the important. I mean, people say, there's lies, damn lies in statistics, right? And so when you talk about things like criminality, it is very odd to me um, that we're starting from a place of like criminal genes and all of that. I mean, if you want to test a hypothesis, right? If you thought crime was driven by poverty, there's a paper I can show it to you if you want. It should be about 35% for Black people. It should be around 30-35%. And across the board, it's 30-35% once you control for socioeconomic factors. Same is true for IQ. Same IQ. Some have even argued that IQ is literally just a measure of literacy, which is why your favorite people, I'm sure you love them, Ashkenazi Jews, score very well when it comes to IQ. That's a population that has been literate for a long time because of their faith, right? Reading the Torah was literally central to their culture. Literacy was central to their culture. And so today what that means is that they're going to test high on IQ tests, right? Here's my question, because we're going all over the place, and I just want to really keep it focused, point by point. We haven't even defined IQ, right? You want to connect race to IQ. I'm gonna, for the time being, we're accepting Black as a race and white as a race and whatever as a race, right? Just for the sake of argument. You want to connect those races to IQ. But is IQ an actual observable thing? Is it real? Does it exist? Or is it just a whole bunch of correlated things? Is my question.
Okay, well, I mean, I take IQ skepticism seriously, and I'm not saying IQ is a perfect measure, and I'm not saying that it captures every aspect of what we could call human intelligence. So I'm open to the thought that IQ is an improper measure by various ways, but what I'm certain of is that IQ test measures something. It measures something that has some predictive power over educational attainment, income, success in the free market. So to me, it doesn't really matter whether IQ is a true measure of intelligence and even how we define it. The fact is that IQ tests are a cognitive test. They measure something in people's brain, and that is enough for me for them to be interesting. And the fact that they have as much predictive power as they do on so many aspects of life, to me, satisfies my criteria for it being a valid cognitive measure of something.
Yeah. So now we're in my wheelhouse, because before we were having a biological discussion and you were the authority. Well, right. But correlation, causation, right? I don't have to bring up that fallacy for you, right? You can't be satisfied with that as a scientist, though. If you were some Joe Schmo down the street, fine, but you're a PhD. You're a PhD. I haven't seen if you've written papers, but you've probably written papers, right? You've taught at an esteemed university, right? So you're an intelligent man, and so it's actually unacceptable that you literally just said, "Well, if there's a correlation, I'm fine with the correlation." The issue is this: is that polio correlated with ice cream consumption. It did. Because people swam in pools during the summer because it was hotter, and people also ate ice cream because it was hotter. So just walk. If we could just walked away and said, "Well, look, ice cream causes polio," I think that would cause a lot of problems for our society. What scientists are supposed to do is to get to the bottom of the truth. And if we can't get to the bottom of the truth, we just walk away and say, "I don't know." If you did that, I would forgive you, right? But you didn't do that. You believe that race, IQ, and the current status of people, right, especially in the United States of America, is due to some genetic inferiority. And I'm telling you, okay, you have that position. Okay, big boy, you should have a higher IQ than me then. And if you have a higher IQ than me, your argument should be better. You need to work on it, though. Because saying, "Oh, there's a correlation, I don't care what it means." No, look, IQ, if it really is explanatory, right, it shouldn't be just correlating with like zip codes, right? When you look at someone's grades, you shouldn't find that actually people's self-discipline correlates stronger with their like performance in academic in school, right? Than IQ. IQ should be the thing. It should be a really strong sort of indicator. It shouldn't be that IQ correlates with SAT scores, correlate with zip codes. And let's say this. Let's look at people's IQs. Let's look at the IQs of someone from Compton. Let's look at the IQs of someone from Montreal, right? If a kid from Compton, right, and I don't want to use the SAT. Let's say, let's just use an exam out of 100, right? If that kid from Compton gets a 70, and the kid from Montreal gets a 90, right? That 90, objectively, that's really big. But if you look at their environments of someone in Compton and someone in Montreal, and you look at their Z scores, you compare them to their peers, that kid, right, possibly, right, could have a higher Z score, which means that he is statistically more divergent from other people in his situation. That is like almost like a real life experiment, right? Put a whole bunch of kids in there, right? And it's going to be the exceptionally bright ones who, despite their environments, are able to do something like that, right? And so that's what colleges are saying, especially when it comes to things like affirmative action. They're saying, wow, look at this. If you put someone in this environment and they still succeed, that is worth something and that is statistically meaningful. What you're saying is, let's forget environment, let's forget any confounding variables. Race is a simple answer. It's hard to think about correlations. It's hard to think about multivariate analysis. It's difficult. It's not fun. We could just say people are inferior. It's easier to do. And you're right, it is easier to do.
Well, those are important questions, but they misstate, and it goes back to something you said earlier about genes and the environment. They misstate the environment as something independent of genes. And you'll notice that before we engaged in the debate, when I laid out my view on genes, I was very insistent on just saying these studies show that genes have some role. That is what I'm convinced of. Now, I haven't said anything about the environment, and there's a reason why. It's that conceiving of the environment as being separate from genes is fallacious. Uh, Environments are made of other genes. You talk of things like poverty, like parental care. You think about poverty and milieux of criminality like Compton. All of these things are ultimately due to other human beings around the young person who's being evaluated either for IQ or for entry into a university or for any outcome of his life measures. And the problem is these other persons that are around that are doing criminality or that are giving bad parental services or that are creating a negative environment of any kind that you would end up calling the environment, the bad environment. The problem is that these people are made up of genes too. They're made up of DNA. And very often they will share DNA that is more similar to the people around them in their zip code than the people outside. So it is fallacious to believe that because you can measure some aspect of the environment, that therefore it must be non-genetic. As I often say, and Ali Mayer says on the regular chat on Odyssey, he says, nurture is nature. Let us not forget that everything that influences human behavior, other than volcanoes and meteorites, is ultimately some other human with some other genes.
Okay, so wow. So genetics and environment do influence each other, which is why this is a hard thing to talk about. It's hard to really show these things, right? I mean, there have been statistical studies that really eke out the fact that, for example, differences in literacy and educational attainment amongst between like black people in America and white people in America, a huge explanatory factor is literally the literacy rates that people had, right? Um, in previous generations. So much so that you actually can correlate literacy rates, right, of black people in certain states to the amount of the share of slaves that was in that state. And that's continued from generation and generation and generation. The problem with your whole genetic argument, one, is you understand that there are things like the Flynn effect, right, where people's IQs have gone up over time, right? How did that happen?
Yeah.
I thought it was genetic, right? But then you say, oh well, these people, they genetically they're just terrible, right? I mean, and that's just ahistorical, right? It's completely ahistorical. Genetics is supposed to be biologically and statistically informed history. You messed up on the biology. You messed up on the history. I'm not going to allow you to mess up on the statistics, however, because you are committing a pagan fallacy. And why do I call it a pagan fallacy? Because you are reifying, right? You are reifying correlations into observables, and yet you don't have the observable. Spearman, right? That is the man responsible for the idea of IQ. He tried to establish what we call general intelligence, where someone's ability to, just a second, someone's ability to solve complex mathematical problems somehow correlates with their reading comprehension, right? And so he was able to show correlations. The issue is this, is that, how do I explain this to people? So what he's doing is he's taking information, he's taking a matrix of information and data, right? It could be n by n, an n by n matrix. And he is trying to, essentially, he is projecting the information into a lower dimensional space, right? And minimizing, I'm sorry, minimizing the deviation from the covariance. The covariance is the correlation that we all know. It's the correlation when it isn't normalized. And so here's the analogy. You look at a vector, right? A vector like this, right? This vector, it goes this way and then this way, right? You can also view it as this, so the vector 0, 1, the vector 1, 0, right? But you can also view it as the vector 1, 1. That's perfectly fine. Those are the same image, actually. What he's doing is saying, well, the vector 1, 1 is real. And what a mathematician will tell you, actually, no, there are two components. They're literally linear independent. And so you have Gardner, and you have a whole bunch of not only people like Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote The Mismeasure of Man, right? But statisticians coming out and saying, wait a second, you actually haven't shown that this exists. And to this day, there is a problem of reification when it comes to IQ. Now, JF, he couldn't even get there. He could not get beyond that start line. Imagine the difficulties of JF not being able to understand that and apply that in this conversation. Now trying to talk about race and history and it's really a mess, and I just really want to move away from the genetic conversation so we can talk about sociology, so we can talk about history, because I think that it's a better use of our time.
Before we do move on to that, though, you took a big chunk of and block there of time to explain your position. Totally fair to allow
he can rebuttal, yeah, of course.
A similar block of time to respond. Go ahead, JF.
Yeah, I'll simply say I don't have a misunderstanding of Pearson's coefficient. What Bohdi has laid out here is the idea of a correlation coefficient. It is ultimately used in IQ research with the goal of taking the results on various tests and acknowledging that there is a central component, what we call the G or the intelligence factor or the G factor, which explains your performance across all these tests. Now, if Gardner had been fully right, and if there wasn't such a thing as the G factor, the Pearson correlation coefficients would simply have returned completely invalid results that would have been forgotten by science. But as it turns out, again and again, through many decades of research, we have established that there is such a thing as a common factor explaining how someone will perform better in language, better in math, and better in other things that are unrelated also. So the G factor is real. It's an observation that comes from us testing that question. Now, do I hold the G factor in my heart as something super important? Not that much, because one would have to recognize that even if the G factor didn't exist, any given IQ test would still give us a measure of cognitive processes in the brains that we measure. Ultimately, if you can perform well at math and French, it really doesn't matter if you perform well in the two or well in just one of those, we would be able to measure it. And IQ tests would still have value in measuring something about you. So that's my position on this, and I think that Bohdi wanted to move on to another subject.
Yeah, he wanted to move into sociology, and now, gentlemen, we've only got about 20 minutes left in this before we open it up to callers and then move over to super chats. I understand that we have been on kind of this topic. I'll extend a little bit more time if you guys would like the time. Happy to allow you to have it. Bohdi, go ahead. You seem like you wanted to move it towards this, so the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just for the audience's sake, if you wanted to go anywhere in a two-dimensional space, all you need is two linear independent variables. So you think of a compass, north, east, southwest, right? You can decide that those two variables are going to be north and east, okay? But you could have also flipped them 45 degrees angle at a 45-degree angle and decide to go northwest and northeast. Those are your two independent variables now, okay? In fact, there's an infinite amount that you can choose, okay? As long as they're not on the same line, it'll work. That's the problem with what he's saying right now. Is that like, well, it doesn't matter. No, it does matter, because if you are making the claim that there is a general intelligence, it cannot be based off of simple correlations. Again, I could flip it the other way and now say, well, okay, maybe there's 6 intelligence, 7 intelligence, 8 intelligences. It's an ongoing problem for people who believe in IQ. And I wouldn't expect JF to be able to solve that now. Here's my question to you, JF, right? Why do you seem to never take into account, for example, like, I don't know, genocide, enslavement, hundreds of years of Jim Crow, lynchings, the destruction of black property and life? Why does that not come to your mind when you start to think about the differences between white people and black people in the United States specifically?
Well, it does come to my mind, but I'm specialized in making statements that I'm sure are true, and I think that if you start thinking, well, does slavery of 150 years ago, can it still cause something today? You will still be left with the question open: to what extent is this chain of causality genetic? And to what extent are the positioning in the first group 150 years ago becoming a slave? Would that have been influenced by genetics? For example, the slave trade happening from Africa into America. One can ask, were the slaves genetically selected? Perhaps they were more likely to be criminal where they were purchased. Perhaps they were more likely to get in trouble. Perhaps they were more likely to lose tribal wars in Africa, therefore getting themselves into the slave trade. And one would still have to ask, well, even if it is slavery that causes the current state of black people in the US in 2023, would that still be a genetic explanation? And because I have no answer fully on this question, I cannot take a radical stance like the left does, which is to say, well, it's this history, because I'm not so convinced that history isn't genetic.
Yeah, we don't need to go back 150 years. We can prove today that racial discrimination exists. There's an article. It's a study actually done by Stanford. I believe the Census Bureau also, and the New York Times had a write-up about it. So it's called "Study Shows the Punishing Effect of Race on Black Boys." What this study finds a lot of things, right? So for one thing it finds is that um, black girls, right, growing up, kids with similar household environments, income, mom, dad, neighborhood, whatever, right, actually perform almost exactly like their white female counterparts. There's no gap between them when it comes to their adult earned income. Not the same is not true for black boys in the United States, where a black boy raised in a two-parent household making $140,000 a year, which puts him in the top 90% of Americans, is expected to make what a white child living in a single mother household who makes only $60,000. And what are we to say? Are we to say that, oh, black women, they're a different race than black men, or they inherited different? That doesn't make any sense. So you can't attribute it to genetics, and you have to look at the social factors. And they find that the places where black boys are expected to grow up and make as much money as their white counterparts, right? Similar income, similar family situation, are those that have less discrimination. Not only that, those who have less discrimination also happen to correlate with those that have more black fathers there. Those are confounding variables. You figure it out. I can't tell you the answer to that. But that is a clear example of how racial discrimination impacts people's life outcomes. And it also debunks this idea that this is simply genetic. Look at the civil rights movement alone. The black and white wealth gap prior to the civil rights movement, the 2 decades before, right? That span of time, was 8-1, right? Between 1960 and 1980, it dropped to 5-1. You also saw a precipitous drop in the gap between black and white students as more schools became integrated. You also saw a drop in the quote-unquote IQ gap between black and white people. Did their genes all of a sudden change, JF? No, and just say this. Just say, I don't know. Race was easier. Hit that button. Hit that race is easier button. And that's it. I mean, that's what we've been doing this entire debate.
Well, I could take all sorts of issues methodologically, but I don't know which studies you're specifically referring to. So I'm going to leave that on the side. I could, let's say I grant you the observations about female blacks and male blacks, which I'm questioning. I'd like to see how those studies were made, but leaving that on the side, I want to attack one thing that you said in your final statement, which is this demonstrates that it's not the genes. Even if you had demonstrated everything that you just listed, and even if discrimination was somehow at play, we still wouldn't be out of the gene problem. The problem being discrimination at times may be noticing of probabilistic outcome. So, for example, what if I notice that every time I interact with someone who has characteristics A, B, C, the outcome D happens? Eventually, I will come to behave differently anytime I notice the characteristics A, B, C into someone, because I will expect D to happen and I don't want the D to happen. And here I have to phrase all of this in Canadian compliant language. If I'm making this judgment, does it mean it's not genetic? If I'm being discriminatory against A, B, C, no, it doesn't mean it's not genetic. It could be the legitimate probabilistic call that I'm making, which may ultimately due to genetic causes. And so I don't think that any of these sociological considerations get us out of the question of biology here. Ultimately, we are always back to, even if it's a human belief, even if it's a human discrimination happening here or there, or even if it's a system that is disadvantageous, the question is, does it disadvantage actual patterns that would be there anyway and that are ultimately caused by genes? That question has not been resolved satisfactorily other than through twin studies, which give us the answer that yes, a lot is caused by genes.
You started with the statistics and messing that up. Now we're messing up genes again. So I would be fine with you making a Bayesian argument if I had confidence in your ability to like manipulate and use statistics, right? I don't. And so I'm going to make a Bayesian argument that perhaps I should not take that argument seriously, right? Maybe it's genetic in that sense. Again, you cite twin studies as if there's no other study. By the way, twin studies are not without their troubles, right? Twins who are adopted tend to be adopted by people of similar circumstances and environments. And that is important to note. that is gonna. And also, if you take twins, right, and these same twin studies, right, if you take a cohort, a subsection, a subpopulation of twins who come from disadvantaged backgrounds in the first place, right, then the correlation drops to 0.37. So yeah, you can get any correlation you want, just like you can spin a vector and say, well, this is real and that is real. What is actually rigorous, because now we're dealing with mathematics, is that you have to rule out the other possibilities. You have to complete what Spearman was doing, right? A multi-factor, a multivariate analysis. You actually got to get it through. How much explanatory power does this variable have? How much explanatory power does that variable have? Across the board, JF. I mean, if you want to spend the time, we can go study after study, blow for blow, showing that when you control for socioeconomic factors, right, that the gaps between white and black people, sometimes they disappear, sometimes there might be a little bit, sometimes they go the other direction, and black people perform better than whites in their similar circumstances, right?
Okay, gentlemen, hang on. We're almost at the hour and a half mark here in just the open portion of the debate platform. I've enjoyed this very much, but as you're asking JF a question, there's no great time to ask people to move into closing statements. But I am going to ask JF to go ahead and move into his closing statements. I'll afford you a small amount more time if you want to respond to that before you do, JF. But because you went first, I would prefer that you went last. So if you can summarize this quickly, and then I'll let Bohdi close first, and then we'll move over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, the differences between IQ in groups is maintained across different levels of SES, socioeconomic status. So the observation that Brody is making is simply false here. That's all I have to say, and we can be headed toward the conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have callers in the back line, of course, and super chats to get to as well. Bohdi, I'm going to let you start with your closing, and then JF will be able to finish because he opened first. That's usually the fair way to do this in a debate. You have 7 minutes on the clock for the entirety of your closing. You can take as much or as little as you'd like. Go ahead.
Wow. Okay. So today, this is what happened. Today, JF came into the ring as a PhD biologist. I came into the ring as a guy who hasn't taken biology since I was in college. And JF did not bring his acumen into the ring. He decided to bring in Merriam-Webster. He decided to bring in lookerism. Oh, look how this person looks. He decided to bring in 20th century race science about Jewish people. This is what he brought. He brought a spork to a gunfight, and this is what that looks like. JF uses concepts like IQ and race, like many race realists do. And by the way, why call them race realists? They're just racists, right? He uses it in the exact same way. This is an intelligent man. I will give him that. This is a man who was able to become a professor at Duke University, right? Which means he had to have something going on. I would say, though, that JF is a beneficiary of affirmative action, and he has proved it time after time with his statements about taxonomy and F statistics and, oh, let me use this analogy about colors, and let me just wave away a Spearman factor, and let's wave away confounding variables. Oh, this is so hard. I mean, come on, you guys. I mean, it's quite apparent that the playing field isn't level quite right now, right? That white people in society seem to be at the very top. And if you listen to JF, right, we didn't get into history today, you would believe that it always has been the historical case. It hasn't been, right? JF, he won't be able to tell you where his ancestors were 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years. Well, actually, he will. He'll say the caves of Europe because apparently he's a biracial Neanderthal, right? A biracial Neanderthal who feels more kinship to a species that was not intelligent enough to sow, to a species that was so degenerate that they went extinct because they were eating each other, right? There's a site in France, JF, right, where 35% of the Neanderthals found had signs of butchery, okay? And I think that was the most... Why are you screaming? What is wrong with you? Oh, You know what? Maybe it is genetic. Fuck it at this point. But
Is there butchery happening behind? Because you're talking about the butchery of my ancestor there.
well, I mean, I don't know. You know, I got a little bit of European.
I did pause that on your close. You still have roughly four minutes or more. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I am positing my own hypothesis. It's time that we take the offensive on these race realists. No longer are we going to be like, oh, Mr. Race Realist, can we talk about my humanity and race and IQ? I need JF. Actually, you need to spend your closing statement. I need 7 minutes. Okay, you got 7 whole minutes. Okay, you need to tell us right where your ancestors were 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 BC. Right. Tell us how your ancestors compare to an African civilization, such as the Egyptians. Tell us where mathematics originated, right? Tell us about the Oshango bone, JF. Why is it that the Oshango bone, right, which honestly could be the first record of human beings recognizing prime numbers 20,000 years ago, is found in Africa? Why is that found in, I think it was the Congo, right? Why is that there? Why is it that the Greeks attributed their knowledge to an African civilization in Egypt? Right? And where were your ancestors when it comes to the Greeks? That's another thing. These people have created a myth of whiteness. Greeks, Italians, have you seen a Greek person? Everyone Google a Greek person. Look at them, okay? They would get stopped at the airport. They would get stopped and frisked at the airport. These people look nothing like the ideal of whiteness, okay? Italians, somehow, you know, he talks about, you know, injustices and, affirmative action. Italians actually received reparations in the United States. I believe, was it $25,000 each, right? Total Italians were lynched. You know, and you know, it was criminality. That's what the surrounding whites in Louisiana says. It's criminal. It's a genetic thing, you know. But we see that Italians have contributed greatly to mathematics. You got Euler, right? Um, some of the greatest. Euler is one of the greatest mathematicians ever. I mean, let's be real about that. Euler is one of the greatest mathematicians ever. He happened to be Italian. But many of these Europeans, Euclid, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Pythagoras, by the way, who was afraid of irrational numbers. You got the ancient Egyptians over here building pyramids, right? Applying those sort of triangle concepts at a high level. And you got this man who's afraid of the square root of 2. And somehow this is the man we're going to name the Pythagorean theorem after, because I have no idea, right? The Pythagorean theorem is a theorem, which means it would apply to all numbers, not just numbers where you can get rationals from. Why am I arguing about this? Because the origin of human knowledge is in one place. It comes from one people, and that is Africa. That is why the Greeks went there. That's why the Romans learned from there. Okay? Ask people, what was the first recorded mathematics? Some will say Babylon, but they definitely mention Egypt. Okay? Now, when it comes to JF ancestors, if he was Greek or Italian, we'd be having a different conversation. He's not. He's not claiming the Visigoths. He's claiming the Neanderthals, and we've already established what they were doing. So I'm wondering, his other side, because this is a biracial man, your other side, your human side, the human side of your genome, right, the part that is most of your DNA. What were they doing then, and how did they compare to these African civilizations? If you say Egypt is not really an African civilization, of course it was. It was the Great White Waste to be found in Egypt, right? Okay, then let's discuss Nubia instead. Let's go to that one, right? How did you compare to Nubia? How do you compare to people to the Ashango bone? When did your people recognize prime numbers? When did your people start building pyramids? When did your people start inventing scripts? Because the script's only been invented 3 times. We know that the Phoenician script comes from the Sinai, literally from writings in the Sinai, and the Greeks and Romans got theirs from Phoenicians. And so your knowledge should have been coming from the caves of Europe, but it doesn't. And I know it kills you. I know it kills white people to know that their history starts 1400. It starts 1400 because that is when they got out the caves. That is when the the Black Death came and they had the Renaissance and it was all beautiful. But let's really talk about humanity, and humanity is not just the last 400 years. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that closing. I did extend it an additional 30 seconds as JF got that same courtesy when the debate started. JF, you have the final word as you open first. Go ahead. You have 7 minutes on the clock whenever you're ready.
I don't disagree that much with a lot of what was said here by Bohdi. And I will surprise him, I guess, by not being at all alarmed at the fact that other civilizations than my race have discovered things before my race. If I was about to say, before you said 1400, I was about to say that my civilization, as far as what I identify as, which is Northwestern Europeans, has been in contact with the idea of prime numbers pretty late, and perhaps somewhere around the Middle Ages or the 15th, 16th century, where it became something known enough that perhaps my ancestor would have been exposed to the idea, but not before. It's not an obligation for a race in its current state to be perpetuated into the future forever or to be found into the past until the beginnings of time. I believe it's totally fine that other life forms reach some point, and sometimes they reach it quicker than us. Bodhi asks where my ancestors were. It's a complicated story because you end up having ancestors from a lot of places. As you go into the past, you have more and more ancestors. But if I was to do a story of my female ancestors, and I've retraced the female line for thousands of years on 23andMe, and I've also retraced the male line of my ancestors. They were probably living as white people into a relatively free market, free exchange society that was somewhat filled with piracy and other forms of criminality for thousands of years in northwestern Europe, in what would be today France, Germany, Spain, or whatever. And then a line of male descent that goes back to the Scythians, coming from areas like the Middle Eastern, going up into areas like Western Russia, and then going west toward areas like England, and again involved in all sorts of piracy, criminality, and unjust things, and barbarism, basically. General barbarism, annihilation of other tribes, killing of people on arbitrary basis, and replacement, genetic replacement through war and cruelty. But in this war and cruelty, developed a form of intelligence that still echoes up to this day in the development of technology to completely rape and annihilate the other side and survive instead of them. And in the coming with these technologies, such as horses and whatever weaponry that they could develop, they have imposed on themselves a criteria of selection that eventually led to a more intelligent and more disciplined people. And after the Middle Ages, sometime after all those internal and external wars, we eventually got to live under a form of unity under Christianity across Europe, which has imposed its own standards of ethics, which has made this criminality and piracy eventually reduced because it was politically and socially persecuted by the church and by the communities themselves. That is how a race of barbarians eventually came to be disciplined enough that they would be looked at by other races and seen as a model of behavior and as a community among which people want to live, because that is one truth for all people across this planet. It is more desirable to live among the whites than to live among many other places and many other communities. That is why people flock to our nations to live among us, because it is truly a privilege and a chance to be among us. Now, were we always like this? Certainly not. In fact, it's very recent in our history that we were self-disciplined enough to hold a Christian standard of behavior in our society that made us so desirable and that made our nation so desirable for people who travel and people who are looking for a place to live. but that doesn't change my pride in the entirety of my ancestors, from the barbarians to who we became today. That is my concluding statement, and
Thank you so much. I did have a quick question before we brought callers on for each of you. One for Bohdi. I hear kids in the background. Are you a father, sir?
I am a father.
Man, well, I'm very much pro-natalist, and I just wanted to say congratulations to you. The more people, the better, in my view. So happy. I'm a dad supremacist. We'll put it, it's dad supremacist. Over to JF Gary Epi. I just wanted to ask you if you had upgraded your lawnmower yet, or if I still have you.
I will not upgrade my lawnmower ever until it fully breaks, and then I'll rebuy a cheap one.
Okay, I just wanted to know. We have to jump into the callers, guys. The first caller comes in from OG Snoop. Go ahead with your question, OG. Thank you so much for being so patient in the background.
No problem. How's it going?
Good. Go ahead.
Very well.
Sweet. Hey, Bohdi, what different ethnic groups made up the German Federation?
I don't study Germans, my brother. I can't tell you.
That's fair. I figured as much. But you mentioned you kind of scoffed at the idea of there being a German race.
No, I don't. Well, wait. So you're saying you believe in that? You can believe in that, man. I mean, it's no problem. Germans have a shared history. They're a nation of people, sure. But race, when someone like Adolf Hitler uses the word race, I'm not sure it fits with the big, bulky ideas of race that we have in places like the United States.
What you're talking about is like broad categorization, then.
Yeah, I mean, like, do you think Germans are that different from like Nordic people, for example? You know, so some people would say.
I mean, there is a significant difference, but they definitely share similarities, since the Nordic tribe was a Germanic tribe that came from the Germanic region.
So is that Germanic race including Nordic people?
I would say probably not. When you really break it down, they are separate people that had their own separate thing going on throughout history. You know, the Swedish Empire was its own little thing. So most certainly not.
Okay.
But I would say places like the Netherlands, you know, the Dutch.
No, I support
Swiss,
you guys.
Luxembourg.
If white people want to
Austria.
balkanize and you guys want to, gangbang on like German versus French versus Italian, I will actually fund you. Please do it.
I mean, that's not really what it's about, really. You know, it's just about having a shared commonality with different people.
No, because JF is like,
dominating
no,
everything.
because JF is like, we are the white race. We are the white race. And you're like, but I'm the German race. And it's just like, oh man, it's tough, you know.
Well, no, white fits in a very broad categorization, just as.
But there's a hierarchy, though.
People, let's be honest here. People from Africa and people in the United States who are of African descent are not the same people. You can't just take all the people from African people from, quote unquote, African people from the United States, shove them in Africa, and everything will be just hunky dory.
Of course
There'd be
not.
conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
I mean,
logical.
they tried that with Liberia, and it ended horribly.
Oh, Liberia. Let's not bring up Liberia. But yeah, no, I think that here's the problem, though, right? It's like for someone like Andrew, I'm wondering, like Andrew, like you see what they're saying, you see how they're angling. JF is like, I'm Western European. He even tried to say Northwest European. Nice try, Frenchman. And then OG Snoop's just like, I'm German, and it just feels like maybe they're like historically. I don't think that Irish people.
We're making different arguments.
Well, I don't think Irish people.
Genetics.
But here's the problem.
So that you understand. For the sake of this, so you don't even actually have to appeal to me. So me and JF actually have a deviation here. I like JF very much. I think he's a very good person. I think he wrote a great book, and I enjoy having him on. But me personally, I'm not a racialist. I don't give a shit about it. I think it's one of the most irrelevant things on planet Earth. From my own perspective, I view culture in a very different way. But that aside, you don't even need to really appeal to me.
I'm just trying to say is like it comes with a hierarchy.
Facilitating these conversations, I think, is fucking necessary because both sides I think have very good points, and very very little are we able to talk about this stuff anymore. We probably should, You know, we probably should. So anyway, back to you, Bohdi.
Yeah, I was just trying to say, like, you don't really see it amongst like white nationalists where like they try to like put ranks, you know, because you guys have. When I say you guys, if it doesn't apply, let it fly. Um, you know, you guys have like Nick Fuentes, who has like a Mexican parent. He's a white nationalist now. Like the standards have dropped over time.
There's nobody here talking who's an enjoyer of Nick Fuentes. I promise you. Not a single person here on this stage right now who's a
Is he
fan
white?
of
Wait, is Nick
Nicholas
Fuentes
J.
white?
Fuentes, the future Hispanic leader of the white race. There's not a single person here who's a fan, I promise. Okay?
But is he JF?
So,
Would you say he's white? I'm curious.
He's white in the very large sense, but as far as I'm concerned, he's not part of what I identify as. I consider him of another ethnicity, a mix of Afro, Latino, Mexican, Native American influences. It's very exotic.
So he's biracial too. You guys have that in common.
Well, he self-identifies as Afro-Latino. I mean, let's start with this. He has a part of his genome that is literally African.
He revealed that?
White.
He revealed that to people?
Yes, he revealed this. I think he ran a test and he has his percentages, and I think it's something like
they say that when
African.
they say that when they don't know something. It happens all the time.
Well, I think they know.
He's white. He's white. Sure, why not? I don't see an issue with that. There's a lot of different white people.
OG, you got to finish up your call. We have other callers behind you. So whatever you had to finish up with, go ahead.
No, I think it's good. You guys have a good one.
All right, you too, OG. Thank you so much. Appreciate it very much. Rachel, go ahead with your question.
Hi, everybody. I want to tell you guys this was a really great conversation, fun to listen to. I enjoyed it a lot. I have a little different perspective. If you guys know me and my research, I focus a lot on, rather than race, on gender differences. And I thought it was interesting that Bohdi brought up the difference between black girls and black boys. And I wanted to know if you guys have any input on the difference between, you know, we're talking about ethnicities and races here, and I feel like the black population is disproportionately affected by feminism and the removal of fathers from the home and the undue influence of matriarchs compared to the white population. Both have been very badly affected, in my opinion, but the black population even more so. So I just wanted to get you guys' input on that.
Yeah, ultimately the question is Bohdi Tariq Bill? Do you know Tariq Nasheed?
I'm Tariq Nasheed. I don't know, man.
Do you know Tariq Nasheed?
Do I know him? I've spoken to him before. Yeah. I don't know him. He wouldn't be like, oh, I know that guy.
Do you agree with this conception, for example, that the LGBT activism that can happen is ultimately an attack on the black family? I agree largely with him on that.
Ann Coulter has a good clip. I hate to agree with Ann Coulter, where she talks about how the reason why we talk about
us too, right? We hate to agree with Ann Coulter, so we don't.
Yeah. She has this clip where she says like, "Oh, civil rights were for black people, and the reason why we talk about it is because of slavery and Jim Crow. But these immigrants, they come in here, and it's just like, what did we do to you?" And she's like, "These gay people," and you know, she has a good clip on it. I would just say that like, I think that white people view black men and black women differently. I definitely think that this is like an internal conversation, right, for like black people. So I have to leave my answer there.
Oh man, I'm really hoping you would.
I mean, look. I think that okay. Here's a good soundbite. Right, is that oh my God, something popped up. Maybe it's a warning sign. So I think that there is a phenomenon that's happening, right, where like, let's say you don't see the person's profile picture, you don't see their name, right? You go on Twitter, right? You see their comments, and you think, oh my God, is this JF writing about black people? No, it's not JF. It's a black person who subscribes to an extreme form of feminism that says that somehow black men are white men in society, and that the two are comparable. And it's very divisive for our community. I will say that. And I have a name for them, but I can't say the name on this. Yeah.
Well, I mean, actually, you can say the name.
Yeah, we're
on where we're at. What is the name? Now I want to know what the name is. What's the name?
Can I message it to you?
No, just say it. What is it?
No,
What's
okay.
the fucking
No,
name?
let me go in. No, because the reason why I'm even discussing this
Just
is
say
because
the fucking
these.
name. What
Hold
is
up.
it?
Let me point it out. These women,
All right,
like, do not consider themselves to be a part of our community. Okay, these women, they literally idolize white people and white men to a high degree. They dehumanize black men. They call us bullet bags. And so I don't want to start anything. But yeah, we call them Ku Klux Keishas. That's what we call them.
I love it.
Well, what I want to say is I talk a lot about homeschooling and the public system of education and all the flaws in it, and it is very, very skewed against boys in general, but I think it's extremely skewed against black boys. And I'm having somebody on next week to speak with me about this, but I just think that public schools, public education, and then daycare centers and all that kind of stuff, it really criminalizes being a boy in general. And I think that black boys really get the shortest end of the stick of everybody on that, because they have, female school teachers, female daycare workers, single moms, they have their auntie, like, it's just all female influence. And so anything masculine, anything that's natural to being a little boy is discouraged from the time they're very small. And I think this has such a detrimental effect on boys in general. But I do think that black boys are disproportionately affected. So that's all I wanted to say. And I don't know if you guys want to talk some more about it.
Just real quick, I just want to clarify, like, when it comes to, like, the presence of men, in some metric, black men are more likely to be involved in their children's life than white men, than Hispanic men, right? It's just that, are they married? Are those two people married? Are they co-inhabiting together? So black men actually have a real impact on their children's lives, just like men of other races do. But yeah, there is this weird feminist academic movement